talking with God about kings and kingdoms. This week, it's deadheads to the Grateful Dead. 1 Samuel chapter 27 to 31 is where we're going to be. Come on in, let's check it out together.
All the Bubbas of the world, we got one mission in mind.
Welcome to the Biblical Channel. Always glad somebody is showing up. And our simple aim and ambition is just to get the Bible right, because for the last 2,000, 4,000 years, the stories that God has put together in his book have actually brought the best out of the human condition, has wrung the chamois of life to the best of our ability. That's God's desire for you. It's God's desire, God's will for your life, to rejoice always, to pray continually, and to give thanks in all circumstances, to realize that you are a bullshitter and you need to be a holy shitter, and you need to, get together with other people and talk God. That is just the name of the game. Getting together with other people, talking God. That's what church is all about. That's what, gathering with the brothers and the sisters under the banner of Jesus Christ is always about. The very word church means gathering. It's just God's idea that we would get together, talk about him, and that we would rely on him and rely on each other, all in the same package. So the cross represents the vertical relationship that we have with God, and that's great. And the crossbeam represents the horizontal relationship we have with others. Anywho, we are going to close out our time in 1 Samuel. We're going to go from chapter 27 to 31. It's a long way to get there, but we're going to do what they say can't be done. And I've already alluded to the fact that these chapters remind me of the Deadheads and the Grateful Dead, of which I am one. I have been a Deadhead for as long as I can remember, going back into high school, maybe college, ish, something like that. My famous Deadhead story is that the date that sealed the deal with my wife of 31 years is a date to the Grateful Dead concert in Rish Stadium, 1992. That dates me and tells you how old, I'm getting. But anyhow, great concert. The Grateful Dead have always been a fun group of people to me. It's just the kind of group that spans every stratus of society. Like Christianity, like Christians, it goes from top to bottom. It goes from, side to side, as wide and as tall and shallow as it can get. You have billionaires, you have broke people. You have people on the left, you have people on the right. It gathers up everybody. I love the Grateful Dead. And I am very grateful that the Grateful Dead brought my marriage together, or sealed the deal. But I'm going to give God all the credit for that. Also, thanks for the hospitality of Jim Kelly. We saw the Grateful Dead from his box, which meant we saw the Grateful Dead not as your typical, dirty Deadhead, but, from a more elite perspective, I guess. Yeah. And I've seen Grateful Dead concerts from the broke, and I just got tickets for, as cheap as I could get as well. Nonetheless, let's head into our text and why this text reminds me of Deadheads and the Grateful Dead. Also, let me just make one last note on the Deadheads. Deadheads are cool because, they can be some of the smartest people in the world and also some of the dumbest people in the world. It really does gather up all kinds. And Christianity is the same exact way. God's people are in the same, all-inclusive kind of group. There is nobody who is excluded. Come on in, the water is fine, so to speak. But as we come into this passage, last week we noticed that David and Saul, and we know in the storyline that David has been chosen to be king of Israel. Saul has not warmed up to this idea. He is the king of Israel. And, it's been a cat and mouse game between the two of them. And at times it's been absolutely hilarious. And I think the Bible's always pretty darn funny if you have the eyes and the ears to see and hear what's going on as God has laid it out so that we can play it out. It's also the kind of stories that are accessible to us. That's what makes the Bible so awesome. That's what really has kept the Bible, around. It's the most relevant document for every generation. It always has been, and it always will be. I'm convinced of that. And it does get the best out of our human condition. It's not about, some sort of pompous, elitist, unreachable goals. It's just about the average, ordinary man. So David and Saul are the quintessential average ordinary people who have been brought in, to God's storyline about the kingship of Israel, but really it's a bigger story about the kingship of the world. And that story about the kingship of the world, and that's why I've got my Mammoth King of the Mountain shirt on, that story about the king of the world ultimately climactically ends in the person of Jesus Christ. So Saul and David are just fun guys in the story that God has put together. They are both commoners. There's nothing extraordinary about them. They do some extraordinary things, but in chapter 26, we see that both of them are actually, as I called last week's talk, hitting the spearhead. They're on point. Both David and Saul say things that, kind of make you feel like, okay, both of them are on track. They are both, working, under the same umbrella in the same tent. Maybe Saul has learned his ways. We have our doubts because he doesn't pick up on things very well. But we now expect a lot out of David, at least. We might have our doubts about Saul, but David we expect a lot from. And then chapter 27 comes along. And now we see the absolute humanity of David as he sinks back into being a deadhead. He is no longer the point of a spear, the spearhead. He is now a deadhead. And Saul, well, no hope for Saul either. He turns into a deadhead too. So both David and Saul are going to turn into deadheads, not spearheads, but deadheads. And they are going to travel around with their head being dead. And it is funny how, my dad used to tell me all the time, he says, man, if it wasn't for your neck, you'd lose your head. We all lose our head. Losing our head is part of life. We're all, a bit, on the silly side. And the quicker we come to that realization, the better off we all are going to be. And the funner we will become if we don't take ourselves so doggone seriously. And anyhow, so David's story, we find David in chapter 27 now worried. He's worried that Saul is going to kill him. He is now fearing for his life, despite all of the saving events that God has brought to him, despite all of the wonderful works that David has seen God do in his life. Despite all of that, it doesn't matter. David is now worried and he's anxious and he thinks that Saul is going to kill him. And that leads David to take matters into his own hands. And when David takes his matters into his own hands, he does something stupid, as we would expect. And that's kind of the biblical revelation is that when we take matters into our own hands, it's just that we take matters into our own hands and we leave God aside. David has left God aside. He says, I better take matters into my own hand. And David's dumb idea is to put his hands and put his trust into the Philistines, the arch enemy, we might say, the rival group, the judged group, the group that from day one has antagonized Israel, and Israel was called upon by God to get out of the promised land because his judgment had come upon him. So David gets the bright idea once again to go to Achish, the king of the Philistines, and say, hey man, I'm on the run. I need a place. And will you, let me serve you? I mean, David knows that he's the king that God has chosen to be over Israel. And this is just stupidity. It's easy to see. You're not supposed to think anything different. When you start reading this, you're supposed to say, oh, David, are you kidding? Honestly. And honestly, this is not David's best moment at all. In fact, it's very dark. In some ways, we could say that these texts, these chapters that end 1 Samuel get extremely godless. God just doesn't seem to come up much. And when God doesn't come up much, we find David doing bad things and we find Saul doing bad things, and people do bad things when God doesn't come up. There was a famous actor not too long ago. I think Jamie Foxx is his name. And he says, yeah, that's right. God is quite forgotten in Hollywood some of the time. I think it's a little more than some of the time, but we'll let him speak for himself. Anyhow, David resorts to, being a henchman for Achish. Now he is clever and he keeps telling, Achish that he's killing off Israelites, but actually he's killing off, stray, vagabond, raiding kind of groups in the Philistine, company. So Achish thinks that he's doing his work for him, but David really isn't, and David thinks he's super clever, and we're going to find out that David really isn't. But anyhow, it's not a pretty picture here. David is on his own, and he's killing people without God's direction. That is not good. So anyhow, not trusting in God's proven providence is the big surprise here for David. It's like, David, man, you've got to be kidding me. And when it comes to the biblical characters, you should be saying to yourself, I can do better than that. If you read Adam and Eve, you should be saying, oh, I could do better than them. When you read about Abraham, you should be saying, well, I could do better than Abraham. When you read about Moses, you should be saying, oh, I could do better than Moses. When you read about David, you should be saying, well, I could do better than David. The biblical characters of the Bible are there for you to say, oh, I could do that, and I could actually do better. There you go. But let's let the humorous passage unravel itself. But the big overall ending for 1 Samuel is that both David and Saul are fallen men. These are not heroes of the world's liking. These are two fallen men. They're not perfect. One just happens to be closer to God than the other one, but both of them are in God's story for us to pick up from and to learn from. And both of them take matters into their own hands without inquiring into God, and that just gets them into an absolute mess. David could, and most likely can't, still, thought, that he could pull his own bootstraps up or something like that, or that somehow God wanted him to be clever, or but he just can't get it done. And so that just leaves David in this, kind of head-scratching place. Then chapter 28 turns to Saul. And Saul, like David, we are told in verse 3, Saul is afraid. Saul is now afraid of the Philistines. Saul is afraid of everything. And so Saul, being afraid of everything, he actually resorts to, the big fancy word is necromancy, but he just goes to the spirit world. The human spirit world, the humans who say they're in charge of the spirit worlds, the diviners, the sorcerers, those who read tarot cards and palms of your hand and call up the dead and talk to the dead on your behalf. And what cracks me up is that the Bible does not say that this is not real. I've heard many a Christian make the case that, it's not real. And I think that people today tend to think that the spirit world is not real. Calling up the dead and all of this is not real. Well, the Bible does not share that point of view. It just says don't do it. Because when you do it, it is showing that you're not trusting in God to have the situation under control. You're not trusting in God to do the right thing. You're not trusting in God and what God has told you, and that this world is very broken, and you are going to get wrapped up in this very broken world, and things are not going to always go your way, but to keep on trusting in the Lord with all of your heart, and that's where God wants you. Just keep trusting the Lord with all your heart. You don't need to go to the underworld. You don't need to go to the spirit world, like in Young Guns. Why aren't they killing us? You're in the spirit world, a-ho, Anywho, Saul goes to the spirit world. The humor in it is that Saul, in trying to be, the spiritual king, he actually does away with all of the mediums and sorcerers and all of that, makes it illegal. But we all know that, making something illegal doesn't mean that nobody does it anymore. Goodness gracious. We tried that with prohibition, right? That didn't work. We tried that with drugs. That don't work. Just because you prohibit something doesn't mean people aren't going to do it. And Saul actually knows, seemingly, where to find these people. And so Saul goes to this gal who is going to call up Samuel. And why does Saul want to call up Samuel? Because God is not answering Saul. Now, Saul, for his part, is actually asking for God's, guidance, except there's a caveat. The caveat is that Saul has actually heard from God. God has revealed to Saul the answer to Saul's question. And that is, Saul, you are not going to be king, and your family is not going to carry on the kingship. I have chosen another. So even though Saul goes to God, and that's a good thing, he keeps going to God with the same thing that he knows the answer to. He just wants a different answer. And that's why he finds silence. God is not talking to him because he actually has given him an answer previously. And the same thing I think goes for us. We might find or feel the very silence of God because the answer has been given. It's just right there in front of us. Now we need to employ our loving faith and just trust that, God does have the whole thing under control and under his watch, and that we can trust God to do the right thing all the time. And that no matter what, happens, God is in control of death. So we don't have to really get too wound up about everything. So Saul here is going low, about as low as you possibly can. When you are calling on the underworld, when you, let's borrow some song titles from the Grateful Dead. When you're a friend of the devil, don't expect good things to happen. And Saul is representing broke down palace. And broke down palace is that Saul's kingdom is going away, and he does not like it. And he does not want to hear this from God or anybody else for that matter. And so, the episode finds itself there as Saul sitting with this medium, this sorcerer, this witch of, Endor, type of character. And so it's actually quite funny when the woman, so he goes under disguise. I find it hard to believe that she didn't know who it was. She actually asks that question. Hey, you know that Saul has banished this, right? And Saul's like, yeah, don't worry about that. And so when she calls up, she says, who do you want to call up? And Samuel comes up. She screams. And when she screams, it kind of gives you the sense that maybe she was surprised. We all know that there is a whole batch of this, how shall we say, industry. There's a whole batch in this industry that's just completely BSing, that they're just completely making stuff up, that they are just completely, pulling one over on you, and they're taking advantage of your low point in your life. We know that. And we know that that there is a whole group of these people. So it would be funny for some of these people to actually get success. I think and that's kind of the sense that you maybe get here, is that all of a sudden she's like, oh my God, this thing is working. and lo and behold, it is Samuel who comes up, and Samuel says, what are you doing? Again, it's very funny, very humorous, very, very clever. He says, why have you disturbed me? And then Saul, basically lays it all to Samuel. And Samuel basically says, you have received all these answers. Quit bothering me. And I think that, ultimately this, is a passage that's near and dear to all of us, because we all tend to think that we, shouldn't bother God. And that when we do, we tend to have this thought. We either think that we shouldn't bother God, because, God shouldn't be bothered, or that when we do bother him, we think that he should immediately do everything we want him to do. And both of those things are part of the human condition that the Bible's just helping us to say, yeah, God gets it. God always gets it. God gets who we are. This story explains that God gets who we are. I have plenty of friends that have, in their low spot have gone on to do the same exact kind of thing. Anyhow, to try to take matters into their own hands, to try to get some better insights, to try to hear from the dead, try to hear from the loved one, to soothe their aching hearts. I got news for you. I just have never found any of my friends that have gone on and done this, and even have come away with answers that seemed like they were satisfactory. I haven't seen it being a life-changing moment for them. Their life goes on for maybe a moment that seems to be better, but it gets right back to the same trouble and anxiety-ridden life that they had prior to it. Anywho, just saying, that's my experience, and the biblical point of view is just don't do it. Put your trust in God. Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding, but in all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight. Okay, well, both David and Saul are at low points. And so we return to David's low point. And when we return to David's low point, and let me just say it once again, both David and Saul are deadheads. They are just following deadhead dumb ideas. They are, the group of deadheads that really are just following their base instincts. They are not following a higher calling. They're not really, on their game at all. And so now we return back to David's mess. And in David's mess, King Achish is so happy with David and the work that he's been doing. He says, well, let's go head on and join me in defeating the Israelites. And David's like, yeah, okay, that sounds good. And so it becomes a hilarious moment that when Achish's men, his trained warriors, see David and a bunch of Hebrews, they're like, what is going on? Are you nuts? And Achish's like, no, this guy's good, I promise. And they're like, no, he's not. He's the enemy. He is not got. Stop it. No, we will not fight if you're going to do that. So then Achish is like, oh, hey, David, I like you. I like you a lot. But these guys won't let you in. So I'm not going to let you in. And so David goes on his way. Later, we will find out that this is God's providence in action. God rescues David from his foolish, dumb idea, his dead-headed ways. And so anyhow, we find that David now is out of Achish's grasp, and he goes to find his wife, only to find that she and the people of the town that he left her in have been deported, and now he has to find them. So there's no rest for the wicked here. Now David is on the prowl trying to find his wife and, to try to get the situation back under control. And so what does David do? In chapter 30, verse 8, David inquires of the Lord. And this is exactly where God wanted David. So David gets back on track. And so, Saul too could have gotten back on the Lord if he would have asked a better question. But he asked a question that he knew the answer to. So God was going radio silent on him. Here, David asks a relevant question, and the relevant question that David asks of the Lord, should I pursue after these Philistines? And God said, yes, pursue and overtake them, and surely you shall rescue them. You'll get your wife back and all of that. And that's exactly what happens, is everything ends up working out okay. And don't forget, this is God's book. God is the hero of the story. So God will intervene in his story to keep his story going the way he wants. David is going to be the king of his kingdom, his earthly kingdom, Israel. And so he is going to give him an assist whenever David's head is dead. And David's head is now getting back on his shoulders because he's now inquiring of the Lord. And that's exactly where God wants us to. He just wants us in that place where we are inquiring of him constantly with everything. There's nothing that bothers God. That's the extraordinary message that God has for us in the Bible is that nothing, even with Saul asking that same question, God's not mad at him for asking that same question. He's just not going to give a different answer because he's already given an answer. But God welcomes us and cherishes the idea that we constantly come to him in prayer and think about him in our prayers. And that's what really prayer is about. It's just about always bringing God into our thoughts and into our minds and into our decision-making and into our perspective of whatever is going on, to both be comforted by the low point that we're in and to also be comforted with the hope and the possibility that we are still God's and we are still cherished by him despite where we are, and that there is hope that we can get out of the mess that we get in. And so the story now turns, to chapter 31. Saul and this kind of clash of the Philistines and the Israelites happens, and it is the end of Saul. Saul will go from being a deadhead to truly losing his head. In the end here, chapter 31, the battle presses hard against Saul and Jonathan, our beloved Jonathan. Man, love that guy. But Jonathan, with his father and his two brothers, die. they are killed. And the Philistines take them and they cut Saul's head off, and they make a mockery of all of this. We'll pick back up with that in 2 Samuel chapter 1 as to what, then happens. But 1 Samuel closes with losing your head. And so, how might we recap this, section? Not a whole lot of, big spirituality, just some basic spirituality. That don't be a deadhead, be the Grateful Dead. David transitions from a deadhead to the Grateful Dead, getting back to inquiring of the Lord and trusting in the Lord with all of his heart. Saul goes from being a deadhead to losing his head, and we could have suspected this might have happened, and it is going to be the end of the story with Saul, which is going to be the true beginning of the story with David. He will become king of Israel. But when we get to the end of David's life, we will find that he is not the real king that humanity has been looking for. He is not the savior of all humanity. That king is coming, and that king comes in another 1,000 years as God brings his climactic story to an end in Jesus Christ. But it's still the same story, ladies and gentlemen, and that's what makes the biblical narrative so extraordinary and fun. It is extraordinary because it's ordinary, but at the same time, it's extraordinary because it's God's. And God is bringing a true king to the world. In the life of David and Saul, we see that making a friend of the devil is not a good idea. That there's fire on the mountain, as we might sing. The fire on the mountain, flushes David out to the Philistines, and he makes a friend with the devil. Saul makes a friend with the devil, with the witch, who calls up Samuel. And all of this just brings out a box of rain. But David keeps on trucking. Trucking is what we need to do. And yes, it's a long, strange trip. It's a long, strange trip that David goes through, but David keeps his eye on the prize, and the prize is God. And as he keeps his eye on the prize, he truly is an ordinary hero. He is the kind of hero that is available to all of us, keeping our eye and keeping our relationship on with God. And when we do that, we are playing in the band. We are playing in the band. And, we keep messing around in life and creating touches of gray. But the real good news is that God loves us. Even when we're deadheads, even when we lose our head, God loves us, but he has given us a true head. The head of the church, the head of the world, is no other than the person of Jesus Christ. And that's where the story goes. And that's what makes the story so good. It was relevant then. It is relevant now. God's doing the same thing in human lives because human lives are still the same as they've ever been. Same as it ever was. Maybe we should talk about the talking heads. Anyhow, we'll catch you next time.